When we left off, the fire had just done the unthinkable. It jumped the South Saluda River. By Tuesday night, 13,000 acres were burning with zero containment, and Wednesday morning brought no relief. The fire kept growing, and mandatory evacuations expanded as reality set in. This wasn't going to be contained quickly.
Firefighters in South Carolina racing to get the upper hand against the raging Table Rock fire, still 0% contained.
It has crossed the line into North Carolina.
The blaze fueled by dry and gusty winds exploding to over 10,900 acres in the last week. Nearly 1,400 homes under evacuation orders.
With multiple aircraft now working the fire, the airspace above Table Rock had become incredibly complex to manage. Lee Berry, serving as overwatch from his forestry plane, found himself dealing with more than just finding fires and coordinating drops.
So I have to stay above the helicopters, but I have to stay below the air tankers dropping retardant that are coming in. I got sandwiched between the terrain and the tankers for a day, put me in very turbulent air because it was very windy and the wind's coming across those ridges. Then you get the thermal from the fire itself causing other set of turbulence. So I was getting bounced around pretty aggressively for 3 or 4 days over the fire.
But the turbulence and the complex airspace weren't Lee's only concerns. He also had to watch for fire spread, changing weather conditions, and coordinate with other aircraft. And then there was something else, a problem that's become more common at high-profile incidents like this.
I was looking for potential problems like drones, and that became a factor. I saw it because it was within 40 feet of me and I almost hit it. I believe it was a hobby drone, but yes, we had people coming and flying these smaller drones or unmanned aerial vehicles in the fire area, and I personally almost hit one and have had to talk to FAA about that 2 or 3 times now. It's become a reoccurring problem with these incidents that attract a lot of attention, is people flying their personal drones in the airspace where we're trying to do firefighting operations. And in fact, there was one last week in North Carolina that they had to stop what they were doing because the drones were creating a hazard for the firefighting aircraft. So
all of this meant firefighters couldn't just focus on that main fire. They had to think strategically about where to deploy their limited resources.
It ebbs and flows somewhat based on the weather and somewhat based on the terrain. So a fire, when it was on top of the mountain and it started to fall off the sides, vegetation would just fall below you. Fire runs uphill a lot faster than it burns downhill because the fire is sitting there in the grass and brush, and the radiant heat's heating the fuel above it. And so when that fire reaches the heated fuel, it's already at a higher temperature. It takes less energy to make it reach combustion temperatures, and it more explosively burn, more energy is released. So, as the fire would back down a hill on the backside of Table Rock, it was slower. When it crossed the Saluda River and got to Greenville, it was going uphill, so it's running a lot faster.
All of this meant firefighters couldn't just focus on the main fire. They had to think strategically about where to deploy their resources.
It depends. If the head of the fire is heading into the woods and there are no homes, we may completely ignore the head and focus on the right or left side where there's structures that are threatened. Probably heard fight fire with fire, right? We'll actually light fires to turn to steer a wildfire sometimes. You can go ahead of it and start a fire against a fire break and burn out the fuel so that when the main fire hits that burn area, it's looking for something to burn and it turns to the left because there's no fuel in front of it. Our guys are trained when they take that bulldozer off the truck or get a hand tool. If the fire's in the woods, we can catch that later, but our first priority is getting people out of the way and protecting the structures and infrastructure, right? So we may not even chase the main fire and just go prepare around the structure so that they don't get burned, and we'll catch up with the fire later in the woods. So it really changes minute by minute, day by day.
By Thursday, March 27th, with all these factors working against them, it was clear they needed something bigger. That's when Table Rock became the #1 priority fire in the United States.
One thing is we became sort of that priority fire we talked about, and instead of being 10th on the list and not getting everything we asked for, we rose to the top because of the capacity that this fire had to be big and the number of structures threatened and the threat of it becoming a big fire in 2 states instead of just one, Once we got to that, we started getting crews in and more equipment and more aircraft and, all these things that we needed.
That priority status meant South Carolina could now access the heaviest firefighting aircraft in the country, including something that had never been used in the state before, the DC-10, which is a massive converted jet that can drop 9,400 gallons of fire retardant in a single pass. For perspective, that's more than 10 times what those Fireboss planes could carry.
This is the first time that we know of a DC-10 was used. I know it's the first time it was dropping in South Carolina. I think it may be the first time on the East Coast that the VLAT dropped. The other first is one day, I can't remember which day, but I had a meeting at 6 o'clock, and at 5:45, the air attack, sort of spotter planes up there coordinating the airspace said, "Hey, I need to talk to you." And he said, "Where do you want this load of retardant? The red stuff." And I said, "Well, here's where we think we need it." He flew around, said, "We can't get there. Where's your second choice? Too much smoke. We can't see what we're doing." I said, "All right, go here." He said, "Where do you want the other loads?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, you got 5 tankers coming." So 4 LATs, the large air tankers, they bring 4,000 gallons or so at a time, and 1 VLAT, which is a DC-10, 9,400 gallons at a load. So they lined up those 5 tankers, all came in one after another and laid down a line in a place where we just didn't have time or a way to put in a fire break between where the fire was heading and where the homes were.
So, where do you think those planes came from? I had no clue and had to ask. Well, they flew up from Lake City, Florida, about an hour away, then refueled in Chattanooga to get right back to the action faster. But coordinating a DC-10 drop isn't something Lee could handle from his forestry plane.
I cannot control a contract aircraft of the U.S. Forestry, so I can't call in a drop of that retardant. They have to bring their own control aircraft in to do that. On the big heavy tankers, they actually have a scout plane. That's not the control airplane. That's the airplane helping the bigger aircraft get to where the drop's needed. And you're talking about issues. Visibility in a fire area is always an issue because you've got smoke. And the wind's dictating what the smoke does. So, you have to work around the smoke. You cannot fly into it. You're asking for all types of trouble if you actually get into the smoke. Anyway, the smaller airplane helps the big airplane find where it's supposed to drop its retardant load and do it safely.
While those massive aircraft were making history overhead, down on the ground, the fight was finally turning. By day 10, March 30th, the Table Rock fire had grown to nearly 11,000 acres, with 507 acres in North Carolina. But containment lines were starting to improve. With 330-something personnel deployed across both fires, the daily routine had settled into a rhythm. Here's Max Stone describing what he witnessed.
All the crews would get together at the Wesleyan camp there right next to Table Rock. And so you're sitting there at base camp looking up at Table Rock. You could see smoke. Smoke is everywhere. And they met first thing in the morning and everyone was briefed on the situation report, the sit rep. And they would be then divided into different divisions in which different companies of wildland firefighters and volunteers across all different agencies would be deployed at different parts of the fire to try and contain it.
Mac had been documenting this operation from the beginning, and he noticed something that struck him about the people fighting the fire.
The strangest thing was being up there on these fires, chumming it up with the crews and spending very long days with them sometimes you're working really hard. Sometimes you're waiting. Sometimes you're going to take a nap in between, the next assignment or something like that. But these are fully committed people who are spending untold hours on a very dire emergency in the upstate. And then I would come home. Many of them stayed, at the campground, or they'd stay nearby the Airbnb. I would come home and I'd go to sleep in my bed, and I'd wake up and like the next day, I guess, go out to get groceries or something like that at home. And it's a totally different world. It was so strange that you could just go shopping in Publix. Meanwhile, there's this raging wildfire that is 12,000 acres big. And yet, in Greenville, we're just drinking coffee. And so that duality became really odd to me. And I wanted to celebrate the people that were up there, the work that they were doing, the stark difference in how the landscape looks during a fire, and the people who were working to put it out. And that was it. I just wanted to humanize it in the efforts and pay homage to those folks that were spending all of their day up there.
But Mac wasn't the only one who understood that these firefighters deserve recognition. The community around Table Rock stepped up in ways that amazed even veteran fire commanders.
And an amazing story about this fire, we were at the Weston camp right there by the base of Table Rock, and we spent almost nothing on food to feed all these firefighters. How cool was that? The community and the industry and the churches and the Michelin and, a little restaurant in town wanted to bring us 100 pizzas from Pickens. That's a lot of pizzas for a little place. But they all wanted to. It was like walking into Sam's Club, because there were cases of Gatorade and socks and Band-Aids and, whatever else. He was all there, and they just said, take it and set up for the firefighters, right? Bandanas and, anything you name, eye drops, it was all there. And every day breakfast would show up, and lunch would show up, and dinner would show up, and bag lunches for the guys in the field. That, to me, particularly for this fire, everybody up there knows the state park and the Greenville watershed, and they feel like they own it, right? So in 2016, it was the same thing. We got so much community support, and signs everywhere, and people just coming by. And there's a lady that she was there in 16. She has a vest that says free hugs, and she was walking around the fire camp giving people hugs. How cool is that kind of stuff, right?
By day 11, March 31st, the tide was finally turning. Rain had been falling steadily, nearly an inch over 2 days. And it was making all the difference. The Table Rock fire had grown to about 13,000 acres, but containment jumped dramatically from 30% to 60% in 2 days. Even better news, all the evacuations in Pickens County were lifted, and Greenville County evacuations were downgraded to voluntary. For the first time since the whole thing started, firefighters could actually work directly along the fire's edge instead of just trying to slow it down. The final push came quickly after that. By April 2nd, containment had reached close to 100%, and crews were shifting from fighting fire to cleaning up, installing water bars to prevent erosion, rehabilitating all those bulldozer lines they had cut through the forest. On April 9th, nearly 3 weeks after it all began, officials declared the Table Rock complex fire fully contained. The final tally? 15,973 acres burned across South Carolina and North Carolina, making it the largest mountain wildfire in state history. But remarkably, despite threatening hundreds of homes and burning for weeks, not a single structure was lost.
If we hadn't had these aircraft, this fire would have been a lot bigger, a lot sooner, and we would have almost certainly lost cabins and homes, and we would have had a lot more burn into North Carolina. So all told, at the Table Rock fire, that complex between the Table Rock and Persimmon fires, we just by air, we brought 1,141,000 gallons of water to the fire.
Over 1 million gallons. That's enough to fill like 30 Olympic pools, all dropped from the sky. But Mac Stone had a different perspective on what this fire meant.
Well, in all, historically and naturally, fires belong here. We're supposed to have fires. You can see it in the way that the ecosystems are rebounding. If you go and drive down Persimmon Ridge, we have several properties on Persimmon Ridge that was another hot spot of the fire, and they look beautiful. You clear out that fuel, and things are scorched, but gosh, Trillium are up and Mayapple are up, and it's gorgeous. It's the ecosystem knows how to handle it. The hard part is when you get people's homes surrounding these hotspots, and how you manage that, it becomes very difficult, because what ends up happening when you're around these urban areas or these collection of homes and steep terrain, what you end up doing is suppressing fire, because you don't want them to get out of control and you don't want them to burn up the homes. And so when you do have a fire, it explodes with fuel. So the agencies have a real tough job on their hands of trying to balance what is ecologically right to do and normal, and also how to preserve homes and property. And that's a real tight rope to walk. It's real difficult.
When it was all over, Daryl Jones had one thing on his mind: the people who made it all possible.
Our team of people and the heart and soul that our folks showed on these fires, man, it is hard to put into words how impressed my own folks are. And I've been in the fire chief job for 20 years, with the agency for almost 40, right? So I've trained most of these people. To see them all pull together and the amount of work that they did and the things they accomplished, I can't even express how impressed I am with our own folks, and the attitude and the way they showed up and put everything out there to protect people. It's amazing to me what our folks do.
But even as they celebrated this victory, Daryl was already thinking ahead. Remember all that debris from Hurricane Helene that helped fuel this fire?
What fell in Helene wasn't even burning this year. It's still green enough where it might turn black on the outside, but those logs didn't burn up. It's not dry enough. My concern is in November, when it dries out, all that fuel's going to be ready to burn, and the bigger fuel burning release a lot more energy, and it's more intense, and you can't fight it the same way. So this fall, I foresee if it dries out in the fall, we're going to have a really aggressive fall fire season. And that stuff won't just be in the way, it will be contributing to the intensity of the fire.
The Table Rock Complex fire was officially declared 100% contained on April 9, 2025, nearly 3 weeks after it began. Thanks to everyone who shared their stories with us: Daryl Jones and Lee Berry from the South Carolina Forestry Commission, Austin Williams, Mackenzie Boyd from Greenville Water, and Mac Stone from Natureland Trust. We couldn't have done the show without them, and they were all generous with their time. What started as 10 acres on a mountaintop became the largest mountain wildfire in South Carolina history. But it also became something else. It was a story about what's possible when people work together, when communities step up, and when the right resources arrive at the right time. Thanks for listening to The Outfall. If you're enjoying this series, please subscribe and share it with someone who'd appreciate these unique stories. And don't miss the incredible photos from this fire in our show notes. Just click the link. Take care, and we'll see you next time.